Hello. Welcome back. Today, you will be learning quick overview of the Visual Basic Express Edition IDE, Integrated Development Environment.
Come on. I see no changes. Wake up in the morning and I ask myself, is life worth living? Should I blast myself? I'm tired of being poor and even worse, I'm black. My stomach hurts, so I'm looking for a purse to snatch. Cops give a damn about a Negro. Pull a trigger, kill a nigga, he's a hero. Get it back.
So in this lesson, I want to spend a little time investigating some of the additional features of Visual Studio. In order to be productive, you're going to need to know a little bit about how to maneuver around inside of Visual Studio. So what I'm going to do in this lesson is simply highlight a few of the major features, but we're going to cover more throughout the remainder of the series. So in this lesson, I want to demonstrate how to open up a project that you've closed, how to set breakpoints and step through your application source code line by line to watch it execute, and potentially discover problems in your code or help understand why certain conditions are happening. I'm going to explain the benefit of IntelliSense in the code window, how to customize the IDE's interface, code rollup features, and a whole lot more. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. You can see that I've started this lesson with Visual Studio closed. So if you haven't already done so, go ahead and close Visual Studio so you can follow along. You're going to need to know how to get back into projects that you've saved previously that you were working on. So whenever you open up the Visual Studio IDE, you can access your projects in one of several different ways. You can use the start page here that you see by default at startup in order to, for example, create a new project. You can see that link here in the left-hand column. You can open an existing project or to get to the open project dialog, or you can use this recent list and it'll show all the recent applications that you've worked on or that you've opened up. There's also in the file menu a way to open a project, or we'll choose this one at the very bottom, recent projects and solutions. I'm going to go ahead and select the hello world.sln project. We've already seen where it's stored on our hard drive. I'm going to select it to open it up so that we can continue working on it. So there's a number of different windows and panes in the Visual Studio IDE. Some of them are hidden by default. For example, if you hover your mouse cursor, actually click on the toolbox, I guess it's spelled vertically along the left-hand column, you can see that the toolbox pops open, and we'll talk about it in just a moment. But if you click the little thumbtack, you can see that auto hide is currently turned off. If we click the thumbtack, it changes its state from like this to that. That means it's pinned down and that now it doesn't just auto hide. If we turn it off, you can see that it disappears. I'll activate it, but then when I click away, it goes away again. All right, so if I open it up one more time, you'll see this is typically one of the typical configurations of Visual Studio. Now, if you've been following along in the videos up to now, in the previous lessons, we've noted some of the major areas. For example, here's this toolbox area. The main area typically houses the code window where we actually type in the code. And it also will house different things like the property editor, other designer and property windows will be displayed here in this main area as well. We've already taken a look at the Solution Explorer. Below that is the Properties window where we'll actually change attributes of things in our project, whether it be something visual like a button that we drag and drop from the toolbox onto our designer surface to create a Windows form, and we'll want to change maybe the text inside of it. We would change it here in this Properties window, or as we'll do later on, we may want to select a file and make some changes to it here in the Properties window. But whatever's currently the selection, the Properties window can act on that selection from within the rest of the IDE. All right, and then obviously we have our toolbar and menu here at the very top, and then at the very bottom there will be some information. For example, when I put my mouse cursor in the code editor, you can see that we have, for example, what line we're currently on, the column, which character, and whether we're insertion mode or not. And then a little ready message here on the left-hand side. So if there's some long-running process in Visual Studio, it'll give you an update on what it's currently doing in that lower left-hand corner. All right. Let's talk about this toolbox for just a quick second here. Console applications rarely have a use for the toolbox. and the properties window for that matter. They're more suited for creating and working with project types that are used to create graphical user interfaces like Windows applications or web applications. In those scenarios, and we'll do this near the very end of the series, you drag and drop controls like visual controls like buttons and text boxes and combo boxes and things of that nature from the toolbox onto the designer surface, and then again, having one of those selected in the main area, you can make changes to its various attributes in the properties window. So since this series only focuses on the Visual Basic Programming Language, we're not going to need a graphical user interface for most of the series, so I'm just going to go ahead and deselect the auto hide, and now it disappears and we won't use it again for most of the lessons in this series. Okay, so we also briefly looked at the error list that pops up whenever we encounter a problem while compiling our application. So we're already familiar with that window, but there's also other windows that we'll see pop up in different situations. For example, in just a moment, we're going to see some new windows that will appear near the bottom of Visual Studio whenever we're debugging our applications. There's a locals and a watch window and a few others that become available to us in certain contexts. So what are these contexts that I'm speaking of? Well, I'm talking about the different activities that we perform while we're constructing an application, while we're developing an application. For example, there's the design time context. It's the context that we're in right now, where we're actually writing code and designing our application. Now, whenever we click the Start button on the toolbar, the Start Debugging button on the toolbar, then we'll be in a new context called Debug Time, also known as Debug Mode. We're going to be running the application within the IDE, potentially stopping momentarily, watching the execution line by line of our application, observing the values of variables and objects like I'll demonstrate very soon. There's also compile time, and that context happens whenever we're actually compiling our applications. There are certain actions that are being performed by the Visual Basic compiler, and admittedly, it's a very short period of time relative to our design time and debug time. However, it's a very crucial context and moment in the lifespan of or in the development lifespan of our application. And so Visual Studio will display different sets of information, different sets of windows, depending on the given context that we're currently in. They're windows and different pieces of information that support the activities of the current context, whatever that might be. So let's go ahead and talk about one of the most important contexts beyond just typing in our code, which is debugging our code. So one of the most important features of the IDE is the ability to help you find problems with the code that you've written. So there's several different ways that this is accomplished. You'll recall that when we typed in code incorrectly, for example, and we'll do this again in a moment, that Visual Studio will alert us to the fact that there's issues in our code. And we can see the blue squiggly line, the little red X. We'll come back to all that in just a moment. However, to begin this debugging process, say, for example, that there was a problem that the compiler couldn't catch, that it compiles correctly, but at runtime, something's just not working quite right. We might want to set a breakpoint on a line of code, and our code will execute up into that point, and then it stops and allows us to take over the execution of the code and observe what's going on inside of the application, almost like X-ray goggles. Okay, and so let's go ahead and do that. We're going to set a breakpoint on this line of code, our console.write line, and the easiest way to set a breakpoint, as far as I'm concerned, is you click in the leftmost column next to, in this case, line number 5. And when I do that, notice that a little red dot appears in that gray column, that leftmost column, and then the entire line is highlighted in red as well. And so if you follow along in this series, there's a chance that you're still going to be in release configuration. Make sure that you change that to debug configuration here in the toolbar. And once you've made that change, then let's go ahead and click the Start button. So we're going to start debugging. All right, so you can see that the IDE is currently in debug mode because the toolbar has changed dramatically to include the process name, so the Windows process, helloworld.vshost.exe, and there's also additional information that shows up here at debug time. There's also a yellow highlight where the breakpoint was set. So the yellow highlighted line indicates that this line will be the next line of code to be executed. And then also we can tell that we're currently in debug mode or we're in debug time because of the windows that appear at the very bottom of the Visual Studio IDE. So there's this locals window that'll show the value of variables and objects that are within the local scope. I'm sure that meant nothing to you, but it will as you continue in this series. There's a watch window where we can copy and paste certain variables, specific ones that we're interested in keeping tabs on and observing throughout the execution of our application. There's also this call stack and immediate window, which we won't talk about much, but are also crucial to the debugging process. So now if I want to step through each line of code line by line, all I need is to either use the keyboard shortcut or one of these three icons at the very top. So from left to right, you have the step into, the step over, or the step out. Now for our purposes, we just need the middle button or the F10 key on the keyboard to step over this line of code. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and click the step over button, and you can see when I do that, the line of code that was currently highlighted in yellow executes, and the next line of code is highlighted. So if we were to take a look at the console window right now, which is hidden by Visual Studio, and I did that by selecting it in the taskbar here, you can see that it successfully printed the words "Hello World" to the window. So back in Visual Studio, we can see that the next line of code to execute is the console.read line. It hasn't executed this yet. It's about ready to as soon as we give it the OK, as soon as we click F10 or this step over button on our toolbar. So at this point, I can either click the step over button one more time or the F10 key on my keyboard, or I can click the start button. It's changed names now. It's called the continue button to continue executing. So I'm just going to click that, and you can see now the console window pops open. What is it waiting for? Well, it's waiting for the application to execute because it's actually executed that line of code to read line. It's waiting for user input. Now I can hit the enter key on my keyboard, and it exits out of the execution path. So we're back in design time. All right, and back into development time where we're actually writing code. Now, again, I think I showed this a little bit earlier. While we're in debug mode or debug time, I can also click the stop debugging button to actually stop the execution, and we're back into design time. All right. So now that we're done with this breakpoint, we've kind of illustrated everything we need to talk about for now. There's a couple of different ways to remove the breakpoint. I can either click the button in the left-hand column, the little red dot, or making sure that my mouse cursor is on the line of code that I want to remove. I could also hit the F9 key on my keyboard, or I can go to the debug menu and select toggle breakpoint, which will turn it on or off. All right, so a couple different ways to accomplish that. All right, so moving on, let's talk about code comments. Several times throughout this series, I'm going to comment out some code, a line of code, and replace it with a different line of code. Or I'm going to create a line of English text that I don't want the compiler to consider while it's compiling the code into a .NET assembly. I just want to leave it as a note to self, all right, a to-do item maybe. And so to do this, what I'm going to do is just use the single quote on the keyboard. It's the character underneath the double quote. On my keyboard, it's next to the enter key, all right? So once I type that, I can type anything in a code comment, and it won't be compiled into my source code, into the .NET assembly, all right? Another way that I can do it, if I needed to comment out multiple lines of code, is to select multiple lines and then select this comment out selected lines button on my toolbar to comment out everything that I want to in one fell swoop. Or I can select those lines of code that I want to uncomment out and make them, again, active by selecting the button that's right next to it, the uncomment the selected lines, and now you can see that they are recognized, again, by the IDE as being real lines of code. All right, so it's more convenient, I think, to just go down the line in some cases and just add comments that way, but you can choose either method. Okay, so now that we're talking about the code window, let's talk about IntelliSense. You'll recall that as we were typing that first line of code, let's go ahead and duplicate what we were doing. As I was typing, this little window popped up underneath what I was typing with filtering out the different classes or options that I could type next in a little window called IntelliSense. And after you master it, it can change the way that you write code. You can write it much more quickly, and it helps you to remember what it is that you need to type next in some cases. You can type more accurately because you're not typing out the entire word. So first of all, it lets you know which options are available to you contextually. So in this situation, what could I possibly type next? Well, it gives you all the options that in this case start with CONS, all right? And in this case, as I keep typing letters, it's going to help me find the console class. And then, now that I've found what I'm looking for, I can just hit the next logical part of what I need. In this case, I know that I'm going to need the dot operator because I want to go console dot write line. Now, when I hit the dot on my keyboard, notice that it finishes typing console for me and it types it correctly. Now, let's say, for example, I just type in 3 letters con. It doesn't put me in the right spot. It wants to create a const or a constant, and I don't want that. But I'm not sure exactly the spelling of what it is that I need. I can use the up and down arrow keys on my keyboard to find console, and then once I've highlighted it in the IntelliSense window, I can hit the dot or whatever would logically come next, whether it be a parenthesis, a space, whatever the case might be, and it will type out the rest of it for me. Pretty awesome. Not only that, but then it shows me all of the members of the console class. So in this case, read line is a common selection, but I want to use my down arrows to look for write line. Now, if there are too many selections left, I can filter that list by typing WR, and now it's shortened that list to just 2 possible options, write or write line. And there's another thing that I want to point out here is that Visual Basic has a special feature that you don't find in C#, for example, in so much that they give you a common list, not necessarily all the options at this point. So if you were to click the little all underneath this, it will show you, in this case might be kind of a bad because there's not that many things to choose from, but it'll show you more options if you choose all, but in common it'll filter them down even more to those that are common in this situation in Visual Basic based on what you've probably done in the past recently. Okay, so it's a neat feature to help you reduce down the complexity and only see those things that make sense in this context. So I can do write line like so. And then one last time, Visual Studio's IntelliSense will give you another window. In this case, remember how we typed in hello world in double quotes because we wanted to pass that literal string in as an argument, as an input parameter, which we'll talk about later, to the write line method? Well, in this case, there's a little, as we have our mouse cursor, our caret, between the opening and closing curly braces, it's going to tell us what we can type here. Now, at this point, it might not make a lot of sense, but as we continue through this series of lessons, you'll find this very helpful. So for example, I can pass in nothing to the write line method and essentially get an empty line, or I can pass in a Boolean data type, which is a true false, a char or a character, so 1 letter or alphanumeric character at a time, a string of characters, a decimal value, which is like a monetary value, a double, and I can find keep going until I find string. So this is one version of the write line method that I want to use for my application. But you can see here that it gives you a little explanation of what that method does, and also below it, what does it expect as an input value for this version of the method. I realize this means nothing to you. I'm just highlighting what IntelliSense will do for you. And so as we continue through this series of lessons, I'm going to point out to you that IntelliSense is explaining to us what we can do next and how that's helpful for us as software developers. All right, let's go ahead and just get rid of that. So with IntelliSense, I rarely type more than just a couple of letters, find what I'm looking for, and then hit either the space bar or the period or a parenthesis and let it type the rest. So I can type very quickly, and I will sometimes for longer passages of code throughout this series. But it also helps me type accurately because I'm not relying on myself to fat finger something. I just let Visual Studio type the rest of it for me. And once you get used to it, it's very effective. Now you see these little helpful windows pop open several times in the code window, in fact, even when you're not typing. For example, if I were to hover my mouse cursor over or just put my mouse cursor on a given method name or class name or keyword, I will get these little windows that pop up and explain what it is that I'm currently hovered over. All right, so that can be helpful in some cases as I'm inspecting the code. And finally, with regards to the code editor, it'll give you different types of clues as to what could be wrong with your code. We've already seen this, but if I were to remove the first double quote in hello world and moved kind of away from that line, you can see that it puts two blue squiggly lines under hello and world. And then under the O in hello, if I hover my mouse cursor over it, you can see a red X icon appears. If I click on that red X icon, a little context menu will appear. And it will ask me, would you like to do this? Would you like to try that? Would you like to try something else? We could possibly resolve this for you. Unfortunately, in this simple example, in this case, none of these are going to be the right solution for us. However, in some cases, it can be extremely helpful. And we'll see how that manifests itself a little bit later when we use it to add an import statement. Again, much later on. All right, so let's go ahead and put that double quote back in the right spot and watch those blue squiggly lines disappear. And they do. Great. Visual Studio is highly customizable. There are two configurations that we're actually going to modify in this lesson. But feel free to customize the environment to your liking so that you can feel productive. Whenever you encounter some annoyance, something that doesn't feel quite right as you're typing or working in Visual Studio, chances are you can probably change that default behavior somehow. So again, in this video, we're going to make two modifications. The first thing that we're going to do is turn on line numbering. Now you might say, well, Bob, you already have line numbering turned on. That's correct. I have line numbering turned on because when I logged in as myself, you can see my name here, and that I'm currently signed in, it downloaded my preferences from previous installs of Visual Studio. It knew that I like to have the line numbers turned on, and it also set the size of my fonts. It would have set the background colors and all sorts of things too, had I used that normally or in the previously as I used Visual Studio. So if you want to turn on line numbering for Visual Studio so you can follow along with me and I can say, hey, look in line 5 and you look in your line 5, then the way that you do that is you go to the Tools menu and you select Options, the Options sub-menu item at the very bottom, and it'll pop open the Options dialog. And you can see there are quite a few tabs listed on the left. They're actually embedded in some cases. You can kind of drill down to get even more options within these higher level ones. But if you take a look at, and we scroll down and go to the text editor and select basic, you can see that I have line numbers currently turned on. So if I were to deselect that, or if you were to choose it, either way, it's going to affect that left column where we saw those line numbers. Let's go ahead and turn that back on, because I'd like to have my line numbers always turned on. And so I'll select it now and hit OK, and they should appear again, and they do. Now let's do this. Let's go to Tools Options, and I'm going to go up to Environment, Fonts, and Colors, and this time what we'll do is change the foreground and the background. You can already see that I've set the font size to 16. If you want to set your font size a little bit higher, because in some screens those little tiny fonts after a long day of coding can be a little bit rough to see on old eyes like mine, feel free to change the size. For now, all we're going to do though is change from the default foreground, which was black, to white, and the item background from which was automatically white, we'll change that to black, and I'll click OK. And now we've inverted the colors for the most part. And we could go in and change all of the colors for things like that royal blue color or that green color or that red color if we really wanted to customize it. In fact, some people have done that and created these themes. You can download a theme and apply it, and some of those themes they claim are easier on the eyes or they help things stand out. I kind of just prefer the original color scheme, honestly. I would prefer to set this back to the automatic colors and click OK, and we're kind of back where we started from. Okay, but feel free to do whatever you want to. I want to talk about the code rollup feature in the code editor. It allows us to show and hide passages of code, or rather show and hide code blocks. The reason for this is to reduce the clutter as we search through our code that we've written. Now, in this short example, we've only got like 6 lines of code, but what if we had thousands of lines of code? Sometimes it's helpful to make a comment and then roll up a given passage of code or block of code, so that we can kind of get it out of our way and quickly scan through our code, open up, make a change, close it back up, and then save the file off. And it's just an easy way to navigate. So if you take a look here, there's a little minus sign next to sub in the sub main, and when I click that, notice that now it's rolled everything up from line 3 to line 9, so we go from 3 to line 10. And inside of there, we can see that sub main is now kind of grayed out. As I hover my mouse cursor over it, a little window pops up which shows me all of the code that has been rolled up and hidden from view currently. Very neat. And I can do this actually one more time at the higher level code block, which is the module. And so by doing that, I hover my mouse cursor over, I can see both the module declaration and sub main and all the code inside. So again, this helps us to clean up visually our code and be able to scan through it very quickly at a high level and see what's inside of certain code blocks without actually having to scroll through pages and pages of code for a given file. All right, let's talk about code state for a moment. You'll see here that there's a little asterisk next to the name module1.vb in the tab in the main area. And that little asterisk means that, that we have changes to this file that need to be saved. Also, if you take a look at this little yellow line along from lines 4 to 7 in my case, that also indicates that these are the lines of code that have not been saved since the last time that we've made changes and save them. All right, so to remedy this, I'll click the Save All button on my toolbar, and notice that the little asterisk goes away and that yellow line turns into a green line. So now I'm going to close down this tab. I want to remove it from the main area, and I want to then go to the Solution Explorer and double click and open it back up. Now you see that there are no bars down this column next, kind of in between our numbers and the little roll-up area here. But if I were to, for example, just add one more Enter key on my keyboard, it has made changes to the file, and the little yellow space appears again, and I can save that, and you can see it changes its state back. So it's either going to be, there's going to be nothing there, or it's going to be yellow because changes need to be saved, or green because you just saved some changes to these lines of code. All right, and that's about all for this lesson. I went through things very quickly, but hopefully you can see how these little visual cues, these little windows that pop up, the layout of Visual Studio in general, really help you as you're developing to get all the information you need and to access the operations that will allow you to build applications more correctly, to fix problems in the application, to do things that are appropriate given the current activity you're undertaking, those contexts that we talked about. And so hopefully you've learned enough to navigate through Visual Studio, to be comfortable with Visual Studio, and you'll learn more as we go throughout this series. So you're doing great. Hang in there. We're going to see you in the next lesson. Thank you.
Awesome. See you at the next lesson.
Bottle full of bug, mommy, I got the head to get into taking drugs. I'm in the habit of making love, so come give me a hug. In the getting rough, you can find me in the club. Bottle full of bug, look, mommy, I got the head to get into taking drugs.